Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of my reaction to the Napoleonic Wars by Oversimplified. Holy cow, guys. I've never seen anything like this on my channel. The response to part 1 has just been ridiculous, and I mean that as a compliment. 80,000 views in the first 24 hours. I've never had anything close to that. So you guys obviously love Oversimplified, and you seem to be responding really well to my reaction. So we're going to continue with part 2. I want to just address a couple of things from part 1. And first, I want to start this off by saying, compared to some other areas of history, the Napoleonic Wars is something that I will admittedly acknowledge I don't have a lot of expertise in. I know about it as much as I know about some other areas of history, but I'm certainly not a detail guy when it comes to this stuff like I am with the American Civil War or British medieval history, things like that. So there's a lot I don't know. So this is an opportunity not only for me to share what I do know, but also to learn from all of you guys, a lot of whom I know, a lot of you know a lot more about this than I do. So a couple of things I want to address from yesterday's episode, some things I mentioned, and I already did a post about this. Some of you questioned when I mentioned that Napoleon was, had several older siblings. And everybody knows he had an older brother. But he was the third son and the fourth child overall. He actually had 2 older brothers and an older sister. The reason a lot of people were confused by that when I mentioned that is because just the older brother lived to adulthood. The older sister and the other older brother died young. So that's why. But Napoleon was the third son, fourth child overall born to his parents. The second thing that some of you mentioned, and I just kind of want to address a little bit, is some of you mentioned... Actually, I had to look it up because I couldn't remember what the other thing was. I said something about the fact that I mentioned Napoleon didn't go to military school until he was in his teens. And some of you correctly pointed out that the boarding school that he went to where he got bullied was, in fact, a military school as well. It was a military preparatory school at a place called Brenden. And that was to prepare him for the main military school in Paris. So yes, it was indeed a military school. So just wanted to get those corrections out there. Let's go ahead and dive in to part 2 of the Napoleonic Wars.
After the Third and Fourth Coalition Wars, Napoleon had decisively defeated all 3 of his main rivals on the continent, and he was now undoubtedly the master of Europe. After the Battle of Friedland, his enemies sued for peace, and they all met on a raft on a river for negotiations. They had been fighting for the past 4 years, but now Napoleon and Alexander surprisingly got along like a house on fire. They laughed together, they chatted long into the night, they kissed. The two had a lot of mutual respect, and Napoleon even told his wife...
Wait, did he give him a baguette? Is that what that was? I got you a gift, here's a baguette. Yeah, it's true. Napoleon and Alexander actually did get along really well. Now, that doesn't prevent the fact that they're going to go to war in a couple of years, but he did get along with him better than he did with most of the other folks that he had to deal with.
That if Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress. Kind of a weird thing to say to your wife, Napoleon. In the end, they came to an amicable agreement. Russia would lose barely any land, and in return, they'd join France against the UK and invade Sweden. Win-win. On the other hand, Frederick William III was sidelined, and Prussia lost an enormous amount of territory to French client states. Only the UK remained as the last major threat to Napoleon, and they continued to be a big thorn in his side, constantly funding his enemies and using their powerful navy to wreak havoc on French trade and overseas colonies.
So it's interesting that Britain is financially supporting all of these wars. I mean, they're not sending a lot of troops. They will send troops when they get to Spain, but they're not sending troops, they're sending money. Now, this is only a few years after Britain lost a war with the colonies in America over a financial argument about taxes. So where they're getting all this money from, I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting thing to see them being the ones to financially support all of this.
But what could Napoleon do? The British were safe across the channel. Well, he said, if I can't fight you with guns, I'll fight you with money.
Yep.
Earlier in 1806, Napoleon had announced the Continental System, a total shutoff of the UK from continental trade. No one in Europe was to trade with Britain, and Napoleon hoped that by hitting their economy, he could force them to negotiate. The British economy did take a hit, and they responded in their typical fashion, by going to Copenhagen and blowing a bunch of stuff up.
Yep.
But in general, the British managed to stay afloat by simply increasing their trade with other parts of the world. many neutral countries found themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place as the two European superpowers demanded they cease trade with the enemy. Hey America, you better not trade with the French or else I'll come burn down the White House. What? This is gonna wreck my economy. I need to start saving money. How the heck am I gonna start saving money? Yeah, that's right, you know where this is going. Do you like shopping in store? Of course not. Then you'd have to get up and use your legs. Gross. Well, what if I told you could save money doing your shopping from the comfort of your own outhouse, allowing you to upgrade your outhouse to a porta potty?
I have to say that there are a few channels that integrate their sponsors as well as Oversimplified. They make it entertaining and interesting, and it's almost like you don't feel like skipping over it. You go ahead and watch it, so kudos to them.
Go you. Honey is a free browser extension that scours the internet for promo codes and applies the best one it can find to your cart. Here I am buying 12 liters of hair gel so I can look my best. I just click this button and Jiminy Crickets. Honey stepped in and helped me save $40. Honey is completely free and has found Oversimplified viewers over $403,000 in savings so far. So seriously, why haven't you added it to your browser yet?
And it is good. I use it too.
Click on the link below, joinhoney.com/oversimplified, and you can get Honey for free in 2 easy clicks. That's joinhoney.com/oversimplified to start saving money on your online shopping. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, making peace with the Russians, a continental blockade, and blowing up Copenhagen. Sick of being blown up for doing almost nothing, and under significant pressure from Napoleon, the Danish officially sided with France. But Napoleon's blockade had the biggest effect on continental Europe, who were now cut off from a major trading partner, one that controlled the seas and held a rich, growing empire.
Yeah, Napoleon's using this to try and hurt the British, but it also, you got to remember, when you do these kinds of debilitating trade blockades, you're also hurting the people that are not allowed to trade with Britain. And when you're trying to hold an empire together and you've already become a foreign power that has conquered some of these territories, you don't need to be giving them further reason to be resentful of you. And that's kind of what ends up happening here.
And a lot of countries didn't fully comply. Portugal, a traditional British ally, refused to take part. No problem. Napoleon sent an army and invaded. But it wasn't just Portugal. Many of Napoleon's allies were also suspect. Your Majesty, it seems that Spain isn't properly enforcing your blockade. Spain? Why not? Well, it appears they've been trying to find a way out of being your ally since they lost their fleet at Trafalgar. What is with these people? It's almost like everyone's only pretending to be my ally because they know otherwise I'd beat them up.
Yep.
Do I even have any real friends? Are you my friend, Pierre? Say yes or I'll slap you. Napoleon had come to mistrust his ally to the south. And in particular, Napoleon thought the Spanish royal family were an incompetent mess. Alright, Carlos, you've got to get it together. How can I trust you when all you do is go hunting? Meanwhile, you let this ambitious nobody who dislikes me run the country. And you seem to be the only person in the universe who doesn't realize he's boinking your wife. And what's worse...
Oh, new king.
Who the heck are you? I'm the king's son. I just overthrew my dad. So, actually, now I'm the king.
Not for long.
You people are the biggest cluster of shameless, narcissistic idiots and all around just the worst people I've ever met.
So, get rid of him. Put your brother on the throne. That's what Napoleon does.
Here, have a Kid's Choice Award. French forces, many having conveniently already entered Spain to invade Portugal, occupied Spanish forts, and Napoleon invited the Spanish royals to France to help mediate their differences.
Dr. Bonaparte.
We're here with the royal family of Spain.
Neither one of you is getting the throne.
Fernando, you've been accused of plotting against your father and vying for the Spanish throne. What do you have to say for yourself? Well, Napoleon, I just think great. Well, I've got the test results right here. Fernando, in the case of the Spanish throne, you are not the king.
Neither are you.
And Carlos, you are also not the king. I'm the king.
And throw him in the cage. I love it.
Actually,
I have to say that thus far, I'm finding this Napoleonic War series to be the best stuff Oversimplified's done so far. It's really entertaining while also being educational. It's really well done. I'm very impressed by what he's put together here. Yeah, he makes his brother the king.
Truly, Napoleon made his brother the king, but for all intents and purposes, Spain was now his puppet. He expected the Spanish people to be over the moon at the removal of their unpopular royal family. Imagine his surprise.
Unpopular royal family, yes, but they were at least Spanish. Now he's going to replace them with a Frenchman, or a Corsican, and his brother, and they're not going to take well to this. And this is honestly probably the first major step toward Napoleon's downfall, because Spain's going to bog him down for the rest of the time that he's emperor, right up until the end when he's overthrown. It kind of becomes a guerrilla war. It's like his Vietnam or Afghanistan, for the Russians, things like that. It's one of those style of things that Napoleon's going to have to deal with, and eventually he's going to have to come there himself to deal with it. And while he's dealing with Spain, then Austria starts kind of being difficult again, and he's just going to be bouncing around, and it's the beginning of the end.
When it turned out that people don't really like to be subjugated by a foreign power, least of all one who had previously attacked the Catholic Church. And so the people of Spain revolted. Brutal fighting broke out as bands of armed Spaniards ambushed French troops across the kingdom, and vicious atrocities were committed on both sides. In addition to fighting the regular Spanish and Portuguese forces, the French had to contend with tens of thousands of guerrilla fighters
and then the British
throughout the Spanish countryside. The British even took the opportunity to land an army led by the future Duke of Wellington. And now, British forces were defeating French ones on land. Napoleon briefly went to Spain in person, and he did drive back the Allied armies, but before long, his attention was needed elsewhere.
So, we talk about this in a little more detail in the series I did responding to Epic History TV's Napoleonic Wars. Pretty interesting stuff when you look at the campaign against the British, where he corners them and they're just barely able to get their troops back onto the ships and get away in time. So it's a pretty fascinating time when Napoleon comes to deal with that. And Napoleon does really well, as he always does for the most part. But then he has to leave to go deal with Austria, and he has to leave his marshals in charge in Spain.
The whole thing became a nightmare for the emperor. He excelled at traditional warfare, but this was something more akin to Napoleon's Vietnam. The whole conflict would keep hundreds of thousands of French soldiers and resources bogged down for years. Napoleon was never able to break the will of the Spanish people, and this problem weakened his position in Europe. Hey, Francis, want to go to war with Napoleon again? Oh, I don't know, Brenden. He's already whomped me 3 times. I'll give you £1 bazillion. Well, okay.
So, again, where's Britain getting all this money? I mean, they were broke just not long before, and before long, they're about to go to war with America again. I mean, they're just extending themselves all over the place and just pouring money into things.
Seeing that Napoleon was now caught up in Spain, and with some British funding, Austria decided maybe, just maybe, this time, they'd have a chance. So did they?
Nope.
No. Napoleon defeated them in just 4 months. It was quick, but it wasn't exactly easy. The Austrians had been watching Napoleon and learning, and they had made some reforms, while Napoleon, after years of war, was increasingly having to rely on inexperienced conscripts. So this time, the Austrians gave him a run for his money. The Fifth Coalition saw some of the bloodiest battles to date, including Napoleon's first major defeat, and when he did finally defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram, it was a very costly victory.
And Wagram is not only one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, it's also one of the last big victories for Napoleon here in 1809. It's kind of all downhill after this. And just to give you some context, for the United States, if you're an American like I am, the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States is the Battle of... or at least in terms of American forces, we're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, 51,000 casualties. Look at the casualties here. This is 74,000 casualties. This is worse than that. You know, World War II has some really bloody battles, like the Battle of the Bulge, which was the largest battle in the Western theater. And obviously, there's some insanely bloody battles on the Eastern Front where you've got like 1 million casualties at times. But this is bad. This is really bad, and Napoleon is losing, as they mentioned, more and more of his experienced troops. He also loses some of his best commanders, and so things are just, attrition is starting to wear on him. It's wearing on him in Austria. It's wearing on him in Spain. It's about to wear on them in a devastating way in Russia. And then it's just really a matter of Napoleon hanging on for dear life as long as he can. But the writing's on the wall at this point.
Still, Napoleon had yet again kicked Francis's butt, and as part of the peace terms, Austria lost a bunch more land. Not long after, however, Napoleon and Francis came to another agreement. It was decided that Napoleon would marry Francis's young daughter. But wait, Doesn't Napoleon already have a wife? Well, yes, he did. Josephine and Napoleon had become quite fond of one another, but now that Napoleon was playing the monarch game, he needed a male heir, and his aging wife wasn't giving him one. So it was out with the old and in with the new. At least he didn't behead
Henry VIII looking through the window. That's awesome. No, he didn't behead any of them.
For Austria, they felt that if Napoleon was going to keep on winning, they may as well be on his side. So through the marriage, Napoleon got an alliance with Austria and a beautiful baby potato.
Now, Napoleon has no living, legitimate descendants through his son. His son died without any children, died at 19 or 20, I think he was. But he does have descendants alive today. He had a couple of illegitimate sons. I think one was Spanish and one was Polish. And the Polish one in particular looked just like him. So he does have living descendants. There are people today who are like great-great-great-grandchildren of Napoleon. They're just through illegitimate lines.
Between the failing blockade against Britain, the ongoing war in Spain, and now his recent struggles in Austria, cracks in Napoleon's invincibility were beginning to show. But still, look at this map. So blue, so beautiful. Even Sweden, after being pulverized by Russia, overthrew their king, and after an interesting chain of events, ended up putting one of Napoleon's own marshals in charge. Marshal Bernadotte took the name Karl Johan and became Crown Prince of Sweden.
And to this day, the royal house of Sweden is the Bernadotte dynasty. His male line descendants continue to be on the throne. Carl Gustav, I think, is the name of the current king of Sweden, and he is a direct male line descendant of Marshal Bernadotte. So one of the lasting impacts of this was that I think Marshal Bernadotte was on the throne till the 1840s. So even after Napoleon's long gone, one of his generals, his line continues, which is pretty cool.
After agreeing to join Napoleon's continental system, for now, Sweden was Team France. Napoleon was on top of the world. He had won an endless string of victories. All he had to do now was sit back and not make any major miscalculations that could completely turn the tide of war.
Like Russia?
So let's see what comes next. France's alliance with Russia was a terrifying prospect. Together, the two could have been unstoppable. But unfortunately, the alliance didn't last. The Russians felt they weren't getting a fair deal. Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw right on their doorstep was a bit of an insult. And then their economy began to tank because of Napoleon's British blockade. And eventually, they began to open up trade. Your Majesty, it seems Alexander is no longer abiding by the continental system and has begun trading with the British. Alexander? But he kissed me. He kissed you? You wouldn't get it, Pierre.
We talked yesterday about one of the problems that people who are very ambitious like Napoleon have is the inability to stop. The inability to say, okay, go here and no further. If he would have just sat back and said, you know what, the continental system's not working. We're allied with Austria. We're on good terms with Russia. We've got a big problem already to deal with in Spain. And just kind of would have let that go, he might have been okay. But he couldn't. He could not do that.
No one would ever kiss you. The security of Napoleon's empire depended on removing the British threat, and he wasn't happy with Russia's backdoor shenanigans. And so in 1812, Napoleon decided to go to war. He gathered together the most massive army Europe had ever seen, made up of troops from every corner of his empire.
Look at that number. Remember that number, because by the time he gets out of Russia, it's almost all gone. I mean, this is insane how many men he loses here. I think overall, the Napoleonic Wars led to the deaths of something like 4 million people from 1803 to 1805, or to 1815. Some of those were civilians, a lot of them were military, and a lot of them are in this army at this point.
And he prepared to invade. Okay, it looks like Napoleon's coming for us. Generals, I need ideas. We could stand and fight. No, that's stupid. You're stupid. We could run away. You're a star. You'll remember Napoleon's tactics relied on astonishing speed to outmaneuver his enemy and force a quick, decisive battle. Well, I've got 2 words for you. Scorched earth. If his opponent retreated while scorching the earth, his men couldn't live off the land. And if his men couldn't live off the land, he needed his supply trains. And if he needed his supply trains, he couldn't move quickly. And if he couldn't move quickly, he couldn't outmaneuver his enemy. And
turn his strengths into weaknesses. All the things that made Napoleon great, he could not use in this invasion of Russia. And you drag him deeply into your country, that means long supply lines. He can't live off the land. Now he's stuck there. Now winter hits. It's just a disaster. He got outmaneuvered by the Russians.
And if he couldn't outmaneuver his enemy, I think you get the point. Napoleon launched his invasion and hoped for a quick battle, but all he could do was try to catch the retreating Russians while moving deeper and deeper into hostile territory. As he went, the horribly hot summer devastated his army. His men died of heat, exhaustion, and disease. Supplies began to run out, and his men began to starve. Many deserted, and still the Russians continued to retreat. Numerous times Napoleon considered turning back, but that little voice in his head kept on telling him, keep going, just a little further. And don't worry, you're definitely average height for the time. He nearly caught the Russians at Smolensk, but it was his birthday, so he had a party instead. When he finally reached Moscow, he predicted the Russians wouldn't be willing to give up such a historic and holy city.
Look at this. Before he even gets to Moscow, before the winter even hits, he's already lost, 75% of his army? Disaster.
Without a fight. And he was right. The Russians finally turned to face him for the single deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino. The Russians fought valiantly, and as he got older, Napoleon's battle tactics seemed to become a little less refined and a little more run straight at the enemy, try not to die. He launched a full frontal assault at the Russian defenses, and as a result, the death toll was colossal. The Russians eventually decided to retreat, leaving Moscow to fall into Napoleon's hands. Quick, the French are taking the city. Release all these prisoners immediately, and tell them to burn it to the ground. Well, well, Jimmy the Arsonist, you are not going to believe your luck. Moscow went up in flames, and as Napoleon entered, it became very clear his army wouldn't be able to stay there very long. But he had just defeated the Russian army and taken their most beloved city. In his mind, he had won.
What did he win, though? You've got the capital, so what? You didn't defeat the Russians for good, and you've already lost 80% of your army. You're down to 100,000 men from 750,000. And now you still got to get back, and you still got to be able to supply and feed this army. What a complete colossal disaster.
So he sent Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg a letter. Your Imperial Majesty, Napoleon requests your surrender. How shall I respond?
Don't.
You shan't, Dmitri. Ever? Ever. But, Your Majesty, it will be winter soon. The French forces are stuck 500 miles into Russian territory with dwindling supplies. If we don't say anything, well, then they'll all die. Oh! After waiting for a response for about a month, the first snow of winter began to fall, and Napoleon sensed the catastrophe that was about to unfold. He decided their only choice now was to get out. And that's when it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. His glorious invasion had just become a race for survival. As the Russians realized the French were fleeing for their lives, they began to close in on their supply line. Men froze to death, their horses as well. There was starvation and disease. The injured and dying could only be left by the side of the road, as it was too slow to try to carry them. And all along the way, the dreaded Russian Cossacks stalked the bleeding French army, and every now and then swept in for a quick attack. Napoleon, fearing capture, kept a vial of poison around his neck. At one point, the Russian armies nearly trapped him against the Berezina River, but a little Napoleon cleverness gave him the old Geoffrey juke, tricking them into thinking he was going south and then escaping across rapidly built pontoon bridges to the north. When the Russians realized where he was and began to close in, the French burned the bridges before everyone could cross. Hundreds drowned, and thousands were captured. At this point, Napoleon got wind of plots against him forming in Paris, so he abandoned his men and went back to France.
Just like what he did in Egypt when things were going badly and he just left and went back to Paris to deal with what was happening there. So listen to this. These are the numbers from the French invasion of Russia and how it all ended up. French army had a total of 612,000 men is the estimate. Russian army about the same number. And casualties, French army, 100,000 killed in combat. Anywhere from 330 to 400,000 dead overall. So the vast majority from disease and the elements. 50,000 wounded, 80,000 deserted, 100,000 captured. So just the French invasion of Russia from June to December of 1812, 5 months long, results in 1 million military and civilian deaths on both sides. just, oh my God, in a 5-month war. That is just ridiculous.
The remaining French stragglers made it across the border. It's been estimated over 600,000 men went into Russia. Less than 100,000 returned. Napoleon was now in a very precarious situation. His army had just been obliterated, and the other European leaders smelled blood.
Yep.
Here was an opportunity to take advantage of a weakened Napoleon, regain territory and influence, and liberate Europe from his dirty French paws. And so, they began to turn. Prussia soon broke their alliance and switched sides, while Austria declared neutrality. Even Sweden, led by one of Napoleon's old marshals, joined the Allies, partly due to Napoleon's earlier invasion of Swedish Pomerania.
His own marshal turned against him. Yeah, people are reading the writing on the wall, and they're getting behind. They see which way the wind's blowing, and they're going to get on the winning side.
The War of the Sixth Coalition had begun. The coalition forces had been reforming their armies, and they were now much better. And the UK had also significantly amped up its financial aid to its continental allies. Their armies quickly advanced through Poland and into Germany. In Paris, Napoleon was understandably freaking out. He needed to put together a new army fast, and he called up over 100,000 new conscripts, mostly teenagers. He also put his factories into overdrive, and he was like, you, make more rifles. You, build new cannons. You, make more horses. I don't make horses. Then who makes horses? Horses make horses. Explain how. Well, when a daddy horse and a mommy horse love each other very much. Yes, go on. Well, then the daddy horse... I'm sorry, Napoleon. You're 43. I thought you'd know this stuff. Don't touch me. I'm gonna be sick. As it turned out, Napoleon's lack of horses would take the biggest toll on his army, since his tactics relied on speed, maneuverability, and destruction. When he took the fight to the Allies in 1813, he did defeat them and sent them running. But lacking cavalry, he was unable to effectively pursue and destroy. He needed horses. For the Allies, being defeated in battle by a man whose army was now full of inexperienced conscripts was concerning. So both sides were like, hold up. Time out. The Allies were somewhat cornered, and had Napoleon kept going, it's possible he could have won. But instead he agreed to a brief truce with the Austrians mediating between the two sides. When Austria demanded Napoleon make major concessions, Napoleon told them to shove it. Having had their terms rejected, Austria felt now they were justified in saying, well, we tried, and they joined the coalition. Okay everyone, look at us. The boys are back together. But Napoleon is still dangerous, so we need a plan. Any ideas? Ooh, I know. No, forget it. That's stupid. No. I've got it! When he approaches, we run away.
It worked for the Russians.
He's a genius. The plan was as follows. Wherever Napoleon advanced, whoever he advanced on would avoid battle, allowing the others to sweep in from the sides and attack the French marshals guarding his flanks.
And remember, Bernadotte's a former French marshal. And so if anybody can get inside the mind of Napoleon and know what to do, it's him. Blücher's another one who is very highly rated as a Prussian general. So they're starting to finally team up and do what they needed to do all along, which is to work together, coordinate your armies, nobody go in by themselves.
Essentially, the plan was, don't try to fight Napoleon. And this plan worked tremendously. The Allies scored a number of victories that saw Napoleon move back to the city of Leipzig, where he would make one last major stand as the Allied armies converged in on him from all sides. The stage was set for the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Leipzig. Almost 500,000 troops from over a dozen nations stretched across the battlefield. The French found themselves fighting on all sides for 4 days against the Austrians, Prussians, Swedes, and Russians. It's no wonder this battle is also sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Nations. The French fought ferociously, but ultimately were no match for the coordinated efforts of the coalition.
And there's the key, the coordinated efforts of the nations. This is what they haven't been able to do until now. It's always been one nation against Napoleon while other armies were trying to get there. They're finally getting their act together.
At one point, in the midst of battle, Saxon troops allied with the French had a team huddle and were like, hey guys, I'm pretty sure the French are losing. Let's switch sides. And so they did. When it became clear that Napoleon couldn't win, he ordered a retreat across the only bridge over the river. The Allies swarmed into the city, and desperate fighting raged in the streets. Okay, Corporal, after everyone has crossed the river, I need you to blow up the bridge. Okay? Not before everyone's crossed.
After.
After. You got that? Yes, Colonel, I'm not 5. I can comprehend time. Good. Wait, did he say before or after?
This reminds me a little bit. Monty Python and the Holy Grail has the scene where they're trying to tell the guards, now you stay here and make sure he doesn't leave. And then they start coming back with, okay, we are not to enter the room. No, you stay in the room and make sure he doesn't leave. You know, it's just one of those messes like that.
Well, fortune favors the bold. The bridge was blown early, and 30,000 French troops were stranded and captured. A disaster. And with that, the dominoes were beginning to come crashing down on Napoleon.
Oh, they've been
In
crashing
the south,
down.
An army under the British Duke of Wellington had been pushing the French out of Spain for the past few years, and were now crossing into France. Austrian armies had pushed into Italy, while Napoleon's old flamboyant cavalry commander, Murat, who Napoleon had made king of Naples, decided to switch sides. German states, many resentful after years under Napoleon's thumb, turned against him, and the Confederation of the Rhine collapsed.
So there's another marshal of his who is reading the writing on the wall. He's trying to hang on to his kingdom rather than, stay allied with Napoleon. Now, it doesn't work. I think he gets overthrown and actually executed. Murat does.
Bernadotte invaded Denmark, and they were forced to join the coalition, while the Netherlands were liberated. You'd think Napoleon might have seen the writing on the wall, but he was Napoleon, and so instead, he prepared to keep fighting. As attitudes in Paris were already beginning to turn against him, he called up more conscripts to defend the exhausted nation.
Where are they getting all these
As for the
men?
Allies, they weren't sure exactly what they were aiming for here. A few peace offers were floated that may have let Napoleon keep his position, but the British kept throwing around even more money, and eventually, they all agreed that the ultimate aim was the deposition of Napoleon entirely. And so, Napoleon embarked on one of his most famous campaigns to defend the homeland. He was completely outnumbered, but the Allied armies had split up and spread out. His army was so small that he could move at lightning speed, and he used this to his advantage. In the famous 6 Days campaign against Prussian General Blücher, he attacked from all directions and defeated Blücher's forces 4 times, only suffering a tenth of the casualties he inflicted. Even with his back completely to the wall, Napoleon was still Napoleon. Then he turned south to take on Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia and enjoyed even more victories. However, Napoleon's problem was that he couldn't be everywhere at once, and wherever he wasn't, the Allies continued to push towards Paris. He made one last-ditch attempt at moving in behind the enemy lines and cutting off their communications, but Paris was in disarray, and the people were sick of war. One ambitious and slightly treacherous politician sent the Allied armies a letter basically saying, "Hey guys, come on in."
And there's I can't remember what the name of the series is, but there's a series where Talleyrand is played by none other than John Malkovich. So, I don't know why I remember that. But yeah, Napoleon's problem was always that he couldn't be everywhere at once. When he was in Spain, he was needed in Austria. Here, he's needing to fight both at the same time. And just when everybody gangs up on you, it's only a matter of time.
And so, they did. The city's defenders surrendered, and as the Allied leaders entered Paris, the people cheered them as bringers of peace. Paris had fallen. Quick, marshals, gather your men. We're gonna launch an assault on Paris. Where are my marshals? They all left and told me to give you this note. Napoleon's marshals had realized what he hadn't. It was over, and they insisted all that was left now, for the good of France, was for him to abdicate. And without the support of his army, Napoleon had no choice. He hoped his son could take his place, but it was decided instead to restore the old Bourbon monarchy. Old King Louis XVI's brother would become the King of France. It was almost like the French Revolution had never even happened. But what will we do with Napoleon? We can't have a hyperactive 44-year-old menace running around reigniting revolutionary ideals and plotting his return.
Exile.
Well, why don't we send him, I don't know. There. The location chosen for Napoleon's exile was the small island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. Napoleon was to rule over the island, and even got to keep the title Emperor of Elba. The Allies must have been in stitches when they came up with that.
Problem is, you put him in a place that's too close to the mainland and too easy to get off of.
He learned what his fate was to be. He drank the poison he had been keeping around his neck. But it had gone out of date, so instead of a quick and painless death, he got a painful stummy-wummy instead. Before he left France, he addressed his oldest and closest guard one last time, making an emotional speech that ended with him kissing their flag. And off he went to exile. The deal that was given to him was actually quite generous. His family were given titles, he was to receive a state pension from France, and he was able to receive many distinguished visitors, all eager to come and meet the famed emperor. and he ruled over Elba well, improving infrastructure and introducing many legal and social reforms aimed at improving life on the island. Hey Napoleon, just coming in to check on how it's all going. Holy smokes! But it wasn't all good. For one thing, he learned of the death of his first wife Josephine and was deeply saddened. He was forbidden from seeing his son and current wife, and in Austria, Emperor Francis had ordered a local count to seduce her, so she would forget about Napoleon. Then, the new King Louis XVIII refused to give Napoleon his agreed pension. He was under constant threat of assassination, and there were even rumors that the Allies were thinking of relocating him somewhere even more remote. But the biggest problem was that Napoleon was once the master of Europe. He had lived a thrilling life of adventure, fame, and glory. Now, he found himself on a tiny island in the Mediterranean.
And having tasted all of that, he wants it back. And being the ambitious guy that he is, he's going to find a way to get it back.
And he was bored. Wouldn't it be nice if he could somehow return to France and reclaim his throne? Hey Napoleon, want to go back to France and reclaim your throne? I would, Pierre. But how? Well, I was thinking we could just take this boat. Will that work? Surprisingly, yes. Pierre, remember when I told you no one would ever kiss you? Yes, sire. Well, pucker up, boyo. Yay. When Napoleon left Elba, it wasn't really the daring escape you might think. He basically had kind of a leaving ceremony, hopped on a ship, and sailed back to France. He brought with him an army of about 1,000 men, and he began his journey to Paris. However, in Paris, there was now a new king, and at first, the people largely accepted him because the last few years of war under Napoleon had brought immense death and economic suffering.
And think about what France has been through in the last 30 years or so. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, they have their own French Revolution. They have the Terror, in which a lot of people die. They've got just upheaval after upheaval. Then they get Napoleon, and they've got these Napoleonic Wars, and millions of French people die in these wars. It's just been a rough 30 years for the French.
That's right. The king is back, baby. Divine right to rule. Don't worry, everyone. I know the economy is kaput, but I and my courtiers will withdraw into this palace, and we will definitely work as hard as we can to fix everything.
And say what you want about Napoleon, but he did do things that he thought would be beneficial to the people.
Oh yeah. That's why we got rid of the king. As the Bourbon monarchy began to look more and more like a return to the past, and the returning nobility seemed hellbent on regaining their lost privileges, the people weren't too happy. And so, Napoleon hoped that his glorious return would be met with jubilation. In the end, the reaction was a little mixed, but many were happy to see their old emperor. Your Majesty, it seems that Napoleon is back and marching this way with 1,000 men. That guy? No problem. I have hundreds of thousands of men. Send them to arrest him.
Good luck with that.
Your Majesty, it seems the thousands of men we sent to arrest Napoleon have all joined his side.
Yep.
Well, I'm off to Belgium. If you ever need a king again, be sure to let me know. As Napoleon continued his journey, the king had sent battalions of men to stop him, but they largely comprised of Napoleon's old soldiers, many unhappy with King Louis's military reforms. And so, when ordered to arrest him, they simply couldn't do it. In one famous incident, the troops began to cry out, "Long live the Emperor." When Napoleon reached Paris, with King Louis having fled, he entered unopposed to reclaim his throne. Napoleon was back from the dead. Okay everyone, now that we've finally gotten rid of that guy, let's try to make sure something like this can never happen again. What's that doing there? Hey fellow monarchs!
That was awesome. I liked that a lot. That was really cool.
This time, Napoleon promised he would be a mucho good boy and not start any wars. But the Allied leaders were having none of it. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and the illegitimate ruler of France. Then, they declared war. Not on France, but on Napoleon himself.
Yep.
And when you have multiple empires declaring war on you as an individual, that's how you know you're a very naughty boy. The Allied powers began making plans to combine their forces and once again invade France. The most immediate threat to Napoleon were the British and Prussians hanging out in nearby Belgium. If Napoleon could knock them out quickly, maybe he could force the Allies to negotiate, and maybe he could hold on to his power. Together, the two armies to the north outnumbered him, so he made a plan to divide them and take them on separately. Historians debate how much of a chance Napoleon had here, but this same strategy of dividing and conquering had worked for him multiple times. He marched north with 125,000 men and took on the Allies in a number of initial engagements, defeating the Prussians before turning to take on the British. But to Napoleon's dismay, miscommunication and hesitation among his marshals allowed both enemy armies to retreat, and crucially, rather than fleeing east, the Prussians moved north, where they could remain in contact with the British. Napoleon sent a force to hold off the Prussians as he moved in on the British, now holding a defensive position at Waterloo. Prussian General Blücher sent word that he would come to Wellington's aid if he could just hold off the French for long enough. Napoleon had to defeat Wellington before the Prussian army could arrive in force, and it was close. The British held the high ground and a number of key defensive buildings across the battlefield. After waiting some hours he didn't have for the ground to dry, Napoleon sent men to assault the Hougoumont farm, but the British-German garrison there held out. French Marshal Ney launched a number of miscalculated cavalry charges at the British lines. The British formed defensive square formations, and they tore the French cavalry to shreds, while one guy chose the absolute worst time to go on a bender. The French did manage to capture a farmhouse directly in front of the British line, and from there, they unleashed artillery hellfire on the British square formations. And as Napoleon sent...
And so, talking about tactics for just a minute here, the squares are the answer to cavalry charges because the cavalry can't break through the squares. You've got men with bayonets on all sides or pikes or whatever you might have, and the squares, though, their weakness is against artillery. So if you're thinking of like the rock paper scissors type of thing, right? Square infantry formation beats cavalry, but artillery beats square. So that's what ends up happening there.
Sent his Imperial Guard in to finish the British off, and nervous Wellington knew his lines were at breaking point. But the Prussians had earlier begun to arrive, and now they were arriving in large numbers. And after the British held out and sent the French Imperial Guard running, the French lines panicked, fearing they had been encircled, and they began to flee. The Battle of Waterloo was an Allied victory. And with that, Napoleon's hopes of returning to glory were vanquished. He knew he was defeated. He went to the British and said, "Can I please have a house near London?" And the British replied, "No." Instead, to make sure Napoleon was put away once and for all, they sent him to one of the most isolated and remote places they could think of.
St.
A
Helena.
tiny island in the Atlantic Ocean, St. Helena.
That's where you want to send somebody if you don't want them to ever be able to get back. I mean, that is as in the middle of nowhere as you can get.
Here, a deeply isolated and depressed Emperor Napoleon would live the remaining years of his life. His house was a wooden bungalow, not exactly on par with the Tuileries Palace. Much to his frustration, his captors referred to him as General, rather than calling him Emperor. His mail was censored, his visitors were vetted. There was almost no way he could escape such an isolated island. But just to be sure, he was guarded by 2,000 British soldiers and 2 ships that circled the island 24 hours a day. He had once been the most powerful man alive, and images of the victorious Napoleon depict a strong leader, hand firmly in jacket. Depictions of Napoleon on St. Helena show a disheveled old man, hand firmly in pants. He had lost everything. And by the way, he was only 46. So maybe it's about time you know what? You're doing all right, kid. Napoleon fought one last battle while on the island. The battle for his reputation. He spent hours writing his memoirs, espousing his achievements, recording his greatness, and turning himself and his story into a phenomenal legend. And in this battle, he certainly succeeded. His mark on history cannot be denied. After his defeat, the European monarchs had got to work restoring Europe to its traditional balance and reasserting their dominance. But after Napoleon had spread the influence of the French Revolution, these returning monarchs would have a difficult time regaining their absolute control. France returned to the rule of the Bourbons, but it would go on to stage another revolution, and then another one. Reaction to Napoleon's rule in places like Germany and Italy propelled forward the ideas and feelings of modern unity and nationalism, and his Napoleonic Code still remains the basis of law in various modern countries.
And honestly, and we talk about this all the time, you can draw lines from one event to the next. You can see how what happened with the American Revolution helps lead to the French Revolution, which leads to the Napoleonic Wars. The results of the Napoleonic Wars lead to things like the Franco-Prussian War, which leads to World War I, which leads to World War II, which leads to the Cold War. And there's things in between there too, but they're all connected.
The modern world owes a lot to Napoleon's legacy. He remains statistically possibly the greatest military general in history, and his revolutionary military tactics changed the face of warfare. He was the last truly great leader to both lead his armies in battle while retaining total political control over a vast empire. There's still hope for Joe Biden, but the man remains somewhat of an enigma, and we still aren't sure exactly what to make of him in some regards.
Yeah.
Was he the champion of the French Revolution, spreading equality wherever he went, or did he betray it by making himself an absolute monarch and restricting certain liberties? Was he an ambitious and aggressive conqueror, hell-bent on bringing Europe to its knees? Or was he simply defending himself against an aggressive Europe, hell-bent on reducing his power? Some things will continue to be debated. Napoleon died at the age of 51, officially of stomach cancer, but some believe he may have been poisoned. The British buried him in a tin coffin, inside a mahogany coffin, inside a lead coffin, inside another mahogany coffin. I guess this time, they wanted to make sure he stayed where they put him. In 1840, his remains were moved to Paris, where they now rest under the dome of Les Invalides. The man from humble origins, with huge ambition, ruthless determination, immaculate skill on the battlefield, and a hefty dose of luck, who was determined to make his mark on history, did just that. There is no immortality, he said, but the memory that is left in the minds of men. And in that sense, Napoleon knew he would live on forever. Oh, and to reiterate, he was definitely average height for the time.
That was fantastic. I definitely think that was the best stuff that Oversimplified's done so far. So a couple of closing thoughts about Napoleon. I think any conversation about the greatest military leaders of all time has to include Napoleon. I don't think you can really definitively rank them because they all come from different eras. You know, you got Hannibal and Julius Caesar and, you know, folks like Robert E. Lee or, you know, guys like Patton or people, you know, in World War II. And you just can't compare one era to another. But any conversation about the greatest leaders has to include Napoleon. Absolutely. I think given even odds, you put two opposing armies and give them even odds, and you put Napoleon in charge of one of them, he wins. Because there were plenty of times when the odds were against him and he won anyway. But in the end, nobody can stand up against the might of multiple empires repeatedly coming at you over and over again, especially if you make a few mistakes along the way. But Napoleon is one of those rare people who's not only a great military leader, but also I would say a pretty good political leader. You know, folks like Grant, for example, win victories on the battlefield, but not a lot of success as a president. Eisenhower was pretty good at both. Not everyone can say that. Very rare to have somebody who's good at both, but Napoleon's one of those. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. What do you think of Napoleon as a military leader, as a political leader? What do you think of this series? I thought it was one of their best, but maybe you think differently. Use the comments. Let me know. Hit that like button if you would, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.